Hi there. You're listening to the Estranged Heart podcast, and I'm your host, Kreed Revere. Welcome back to our returning listeners. And if this is your first time here, thank you for selecting this podcast to listen to. As we begin today's episode, I invite you to grab a cup of coffee or tea, settle in, and listen with an open heart. But first, the disclaimer. I'm not a licensed therapist or counselor. Nothing within this podcast should be considered or taken as therapy. If you are in need of therapeutic support, such as counseling, please seek out a therapist near you. A couple of reminders and announcements. I just want to say today's episode on addiction comes with what some may consider odd and strange ways of looking at addiction as it relates to estrangement. And I will say that those of the older generation will probably, a lot of this information is going to sound really odd and weird. But I ask that you, as always, listen with an open heart. If it doesn't resonate with you, toss it and move on. Totally okay. No harm, no foul. I know I'm not for everyone, and that is okay. And let's remember, this podcast is not only for estranged parents, it's also for estranged adult children. And as such, we may have parents who have children with addiction issues listening today, and we may also have adult children with parents who have addiction issues. So please keep that in mind. Thank you to our new Patreon members. Thank you for your support of this podcast and the work that I do. I am so very grateful. And also to the estranged adult children who continue to reach out. Thank you so much for giving this podcast a chance. I know what a big deal it is to have estranged adult children willing to listen to this podcast, because most of you generally do not listen to a podcast by a formerly estranged or estranged mom. So thank you for that. And thank you to the moms who have reached out to share your stories with me in preparation for the month of May, when I will share 8 stories from estranged moms. So thank you. And last but certainly not least, thank you to my coaching clients. I am so honored to be on this path with you, watching you show your big brave. I mean, I am just so honored. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. And as a reminder, if you would like to support this podcast and the work that I do, please consider a financial donation. You can do that through anchor.fm or Patreon, and I'll leave the information on how to do that in the show notes. So as we begin today's episode, let's start with our quotes as normal. The first one is by Dr. Gabor Mate. Addiction is not a choice that anyone makes. It's not a moral failure. It's not an ethical lapse. It's not a weakness of character, and it's not a failure of will, which is how our society depicts addiction. Nor is it an inherited brain disease, which is how the medical tendency is to see it, but what it actually is a response to human suffering. The second quote is by Carla McLaren, who is an author on emotions. Emotions underlie everything you think, everything you believe, and everything you do. If you learn their language, you can change every part of your life. And the third and final one is by Tina Gilbertson, licensed professional counselor. A traumatized heart is not an open heart. So today's episode on addiction and estrangement. Let's first define addiction, right? And let's remember that addiction is not just alcohol and drugs, right? Addiction can be sex, gambling, eating, compulsive shopping, overworking, extreme sports, working out, 8 hours a day, 7 days a week, relationships and the internet and gaming. All of that can be addictions. And dare I say that I think that each of us have at least one addiction going on in our lives. So I will talk today about 3 different professionals who are experts in the field of addiction and trauma. And I think that, you'll find them interesting. At least I hope so. They completely changed my world. And I will leave information about each of these folks in the show notes, of course. But let me begin by saying, I have a person in my life who has battled addiction, and they have come out on the other side So I know the pain that you're feeling when someone you love is an addict. I know what it feels like to feel hopeless and helpless and worried, sick, and all of those things. So when I talk about this today, it's because I've delved into it myself. Okay? I'm not speaking about something of which I don't know. So Dr. Gabor Mate defines addiction as a complex process that involves brain, body, emotions, psychology, and social relationships. The expression of addiction is any behavior where a person craves and finds temporary pleasure or relief in something, but suffers negative consequences as a result of, and is unable to give up despite those negative consequences. So it's not so much the activity per se, but the question of, does it provide temporary relief or pleasure? Does it create cravings when you don't have it? Does it create negative consequences? And is it difficult to give up despite those consequences? If those are the case, it's an addiction. Okay? He says an addiction is a coping mechanism, an attempt to solve a problem. And that problem is pain. People who are addicts are trying to escape pain. Okay? He says, don't tell me about your genes, tell me about your life. Okay? We see in our everyday lives and through, on media, they're desperate. They show desperate people who are addicts, and they show them behaving in dysfunctional ways, being aggressive and manipulative and unpleasant, and yet they do not show the reason for their desperation for the drug, or the glass of wine, or the beer, or the next honey bun, or the next piece of cake, or the next, romp in the hay with the next whomever comes along. They don't show why is there a desperation for that, right? And Dr. Gabor Mate says that your brain is a product of the environment. It develops based on the environment it is in. And so that, when we talk about disease and addiction and the brain, and anyway, look up more about that from Dr. Gabor Mate, and I have lots of links in the show notes for information on him and his work. The second person is Dr. Richard Schwartz. He is the founder, he's a psychotherapist with a PhD in marriage and family therapy, and he is the founder of Internal Family Systems, or IFS therapy. And he says pain and trauma is passed on in families. And he says, quote, I didn't pass on my genes, I passed on my pain. So I am of the belief we generally see diseases, quote unquote, passed on in families, and, hereditary diseases and things like that, heart disease and cancer and alcoholism and all of these things. But yet what is, and I know this was a stretch for me when I first heard it. I was like, I'm not so sure about that. And then I started really looking back at families, my family and other families, and started to see a little bit of this, and then delved into the research, and I was like, oh, this is so spot on. But what else is passed on in families? Belief systems, perceptions, we believe this about that, and those types of things. And so, and the judgments and the shaming and the traumas in life are passed on from generation to generation to generation a lot of times without so much as a second thought, just because that's what my family did. And so it's kind of like, how do you parent your children? Well, you parent your children generally either the same way that you were parented, because that's all you know, or you go to the other end of the spectrum and the other extreme and try to parent from that perspective, but yet you're parenting from a perspective that you really don't know nothing about, because you weren't parented that way and you didn't really see it demonstrated by other people. Again, this is generalization. I know there are exceptions to everything, and there will be people that say, oh no, but I did learn about it in school, and I did learn about gentle parenting through an aunt and saw my cousin, okay. But generally speaking, that doesn't happen. So you're passing this stuff along. And so what are we passing? Traumas. We're passing these traumas along. And therefore, people with traumas are pain. That's another way of looking at it, right? I try to say, stop using the word trauma and start using the word pain, right? It's the pain, excuse me, that people are trying to get out of when they are addicted to something. Another thing to kind of look at too is epigenetics, right? I know I've talked about this before in a couple of episodes, but for those who aren't familiar, epigenetics is a study of how your behavior and environment can cause changes that affect the way your genes work, right? Epigenetic changes are reversible and do not change your DNA sequence, but they can change how your body reads a DNA sequence. So that is a very fascinating field, and I encourage you to look more into that. And then as we get into more of the trauma piece and talking about addictions, I see this in every person I've ever known that's been an addict, is they've scored really high on what is called the ACE study, and that's adverse childhood experiences. And these are 10 questions that are asked, and for every yes you give, you get a point. And so the higher your point score is, the more trauma you've had in your life. And that can be indicative of addictions. And so, for instance, I know studies have been done on prisoners on death row, and all of them have an ACE score generally of like 9 and 10, which is 10 is the highest because there are 10 questions. And so the level of trauma is really significant. And I think that a lot of addicts have very high ACE scores. So I just want to go through, and I want to encourage you to think as I go through these list of questions for this ACE questionnaire, not only for yourself, but also for the person who you love, who is an addict, and maybe what their life was like before the age of 18, right? So basically the questions are, did a parent or another adult in the household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down, humiliate you, or act in a way that made you feel afraid and that you were not physically safe? Or pushed or grabbed, slapped, or threw something at you, ever hit you so hard that they left a mark or you were injured? Or did a person at least 5 years old or older than you ever touch or fondle you, or have you touch their body in a sexual way, or attempt or actually have oral, anal, or vaginal intercourse with you? Or did you feel very often that no one in your family loved you, or thought you were very important or special, or your family didn't look out for each other, feel close to each other, or support each other? Did you very often feel that you didn't have enough to eat, you had to wear dirty clothes, and no one that was there to protect you? Or that your parents were too drunk or high to take care of you or to get you to the doctor if needed? Were your parents ever separated or divorced? Was your mother or stepmother very often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at her? Or kicked, bitten, hit with a fist, or hit with something hard, or threatened with a gun or a knife? Did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker, alcoholic, or who used street drugs? Were you in a household with a member who was mentally ill or depressed, or attempted suicide? And did a household member ever go to prison? So I can tell you that my own personal ACE score is a 5. So there you have it. And all of these things are considered traumas for a child. So I had 5 out of 10. Okay. So just insight. You might want to look that up. Again, I'll have links in the show notes for that as well. Dr. Gabor Mate believes, based on research and his own experience working at a harm reduction clinic in Vancouver's downtown east side, which is a poor area that has one of the worst drug problems in North America, that the root of addictive behaviors can be traced all the way back to childhood. He believes that all addictions can be traced to painful experiences, And he wrote in his book, In the Realm of the Hungry Ghost, Close Encounters with Addiction. And if you have someone who is an addict in your life, I highly recommend this book. Highly, highly, highly recommend this book. Dr. Gabor Mate says, a hurt is at the center of all addictive behaviors. It is present in the gambler, the internet addict, the compulsive shopper, and the workaholic. The wound may not be as deep or the ache as excruciating, and it may even be entirely hidden, but it is there. The single factor at the core of all addictions is trauma. And by trauma, I mean emotional loss in childhood. And in the case of severe addicts, you can see the large-scale population studies show that there is significant childhood trauma such as family violence, addiction in families, sexual and emotional abuse, physical abuse, a parent being mentally ill or in jail. And these adverse childhood experiences have been shown to exponentially increase the risk of addiction later on in life. So when asked if he felt addiction was a disease or just a coping mechanism, Dr. Gabor Mate says, that's a complex question. Addiction has the features of a disease if you look at it. Does it have dysfunctional physiological brain circuits? Yes, it does. Does it result in pathological effects? Yes, it does. Is it characterized by relapse? Yes, it is. But that doesn't mean it's only a disease. You can't reduce it to a narrow medical model. When we look at addiction as a physical disease, we don't acknowledge the lived experience of the individual. The behaviors are just symptoms. They are not at the core. And so I want to kind of say, it's as with anything, and I talk about this often on the podcast, you've got to get beneath what's on the surface, and behaviors are surface. So to understand and get to the pain that someone is feeling and is running their show, i.e. behaviors, you've got to get to the root of it. It's just like a weed in the garden. If you just keep pulling it and pulling it and pulling it and pulling it, it's going to keep coming back time after time after time. You've got to get to the root in order to fix the problem. Okay? And so what does all this mean for estrangement? First of all, I want to say abuse is not okay. If you are being abused, and by abused, I mean if you are being physically abused, if someone is stealing from you, if someone is standing on the porch step screaming obscenities at you and calling you everything under the sun but what you are, that is not okay. And you do not have to tolerate that. Okay? Am I asking you to cultivate an open heart and learn to have compassion and empathy for your loved one who is an addict? Yes. But am I telling you that you have to put up with abuse? Absolutely not. Not in any way, shape, nor form am I saying that that is okay. What I am asking you to do is to figure out your triggers. So when you're faced with this person who is stealing from you and you're not able to place boundaries around that, or they're physically harming you and you're not able to separate yourself and remove yourself from the home, things along those lines, or they're shouting obscenities at you and you're not turning around and shutting the door, right? I'm asking you to figure out what's going on with you and what is triggering you to stay in that. And because you cannot change that person. The only person you can change is you. And as someone who has dealt with someone who was an addict, I can tell you that I had to get to the place where I could have compassion for that person and compassion for myself to be able to say, I love you, but I cannot and will not tolerate this behavior. This behavior, you calling me names, is not acceptable. And I will not tolerate it. Okay? But I did it in a way that was compassionate, with as much love and care as I could, with an open heart. And I had to deal with my own stuff before I could get to that place. So that's what I'm asking you to entertain. That idea of working through your own stuff, your own hurts and pains. Maybe your parents were addicts. or alcoholics, and you're living with your own trauma from that, right? And you're now having to navigate this other kind of trauma, and you're just, you're being triggered all over the place. You've got to get through that before you can get to compassion and understanding. And I understand that. Okay. I'm asking you to get support, and preferably support that's not within your echo chamber, right? I've talked about that before in the past. You got to get out of that echo chamber. Get yourself some professional support, either a therapist, a coach, somebody a neutral third party who can help you to empathize with you, but also to say, okay, let's look at how can we get you out of this, right? And move through your pain and get into some healing so that you can then be able to interact with this person who's an addict in a different way. Okay? And I want you to understand that maybe this addiction is not the pain that this person is feeling and it subsequently has become an addict. Maybe that pain wasn't caused at your hands, right? But maybe, stopping to look and think about, if you're an estranged parent looking at your child, well, maybe they didn't come home and say they were being bullied, but they came home 4 days out of 5 crying from school for 2 years in a row, right? Maybe that's worth looking at, right? Maybe they got upset every time they, went to Uncle Joe's house, right? Start trying to look at what could have potentially put them in a place to have been pained, right? And then their estrangement piece comes at, maybe they blame you because you didn't protect them. Maybe they blame you because you didn't divorce their stepfather who always made fun of them, or who always demeaned them, or who always, slapped them upside the head because they were being, you're such an idiot kind of thing, right? Maybe that's what they blame you for. And maybe to you, that slap upside the head wasn't anything compared, because, I hear this often. They don't know what abuse is. I was, beat with a belt where I had black and blue stripes all over. Well, we're not here to compare. Abuse is abuse is abuse. I'm not here to compare. We're not doing that. I'm not doing that. No abuse is good, right? And smacking somebody upside the head and shaming them is abuse. Even just shaming them is abuse. And I don't know about you, but I don't come towards somebody if I feel like they're pointing a judging finger at me, and they're telling me I need to get my shit together and I'm just a worthless piece of crap and all of this. I'm going to turn tail and go the opposite direction. I'm not going to want to have anything to do with anyone pointing a finger at me, judging me, and calling me names and telling me I'm a worthless piece of crap. That's not incentive for me to want to stick around you and get better. If anything, it's going to drive me further into the addiction, because I'm trying to get away from the pain that I've just experienced at being shamed and being judged. Okay? And I will say that generally the estrangement piece cannot be resolved until the addiction piece has been addressed and worked through. It's just a fact. It's really hard to move into reconciliation if someone is still in active addiction. And I know that's painful, and that sucks, and that is it's heart-wrenching, because you want that person in your life, but they can't be in your life in a healthy way. And to get to reconciliation, there has to be some level of health to that relationship. So, again, finding support for yourself with that to help you to manage those emotions and that pain that you're still in estrangement and you're not able to be reconciled if this person is not willing to deal with their addiction issues. Okay? Again, I know the pain of having a loved one that's an addict. I also know the pain of having a loved one who's estranged. So I get it. I understand. And if I can be of any kind of help for you, please don't hesitate to reach out. My email address is theestrangedheart@gmail.com. And that's part of what I do with my coaching clients, is to help hold space for them to work through their pain, right? And to help them to move through that and into a life of joy and meaning again, even if they're not able right now to have that person in their life. So in closing, I will leave you with this quote by Dr. Gabor Mate. What people need in response to addiction is not judgment and not simply symptom control. They need to be helped to heal from their trauma. Or another way to put it, they need to be helped to heal from their pain. Okay. This brings this episode to a close. I hope that this time together was time you feel well spent and that you were able to find some takeaway nuggets to help you on your journey, wherever you may be on your estrangement and reconciliation path. If you feel you've received something helpful or positive from this podcast, please consider following us, sharing this podcast with others, leaving a positive review, or becoming a financial supporter through Anchor.fm or Patreon. You can also follow us on social media, Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok under the same name, The Estranged Heart. I also am a facilitator for an online support group on Facebook for estranged moms of adult children who identify as being spiritual and not religious, approach estrangement with a sense of curiosity rather than blame and judgment, and desire to do inner self-work and reflection. If you're interested in that, you can find us at facebook.com/estranged mothers support group. And lastly, if you're an estranged parent or an estranged adult child and would like to have your story shared on the podcast, anonymously or not, please reach out via email to theestrangedheart@gmail.com. Until next time.